One of the things that we wanted to introduce on the tail end of this Sunday morning news dump is a new weekly segment that we're going to be doing, where we're going to be breaking down books, sometimes fiction, sometimes nonfiction. But essentially, we just want to create a little bit more of a community based on book discussion on the channel. Hopefully have people engage in the comment section, read along with us, engage in discussion, provide different perspectives and arguments, and kind of dive into the text in a way that a lot of people I feel like are missing in these times when, you're reading largely by yourself. So, I thought that I think Gavin and I both are as big fans of the graphic novel and also the timeliness of November the 5th. We thought no better work to start with than Alan Moore and David Lloyd's graphic novel. V for Vendetta. Gavin?
Yeah, definitely timely. Again, we recently passed the 5th of November, which is bonfire night is what they call it in England. It's kind of like their 4th of July. They celebrate the values of independence and all that good stuff. And of course, that was inspired by Guy Fawkes, who, of course, inspired the titular character and the face mask worn by character V in Alan Moore's V for Vendetta. Yeah, Alan, this comics series was initially published kind of as, installments in 1982. And it was actually heavily inspired by the politics of the time. Margaret Thatcher.
Thatcherism,
yeah, came out of England during that time period, and Alan Moore was clearly, taking a lot of what he saw and kind of putting it on this dystopian future, very Orwellian. He was inspired by George Orwell's 1984, and of course, for those who aren't aware, Alan Moore is a great author of graphic novels and comics, including he wrote Watchmen, Swamp Thing, The League of Extraordinary Gentlemen, and Batman the Killing Joke, which of course is one of the greatest Batman graphic novels of all time. He's an occultist, a ceremonial magician, and an anarchist, most notably, themes which are very prevalent in his work, especially in V for Vendetta, which kind of, reads like an anarchist, manifesto or screed. It's almost like a direct window into the anarchist mindset. It's kind of, this parable about fascism and the need to kind of start anew when, authoritarianism takes root in a society. And I think, it's definitely reflecting its time. But I think like all the great dystopian and science fiction novels, I think it continues to remain increasingly relevant. Not only as we go down the path we're currently going down, but just, throughout our lives with what we've seen with stuff like the Patriot Acts, things in America that Alan Moore had no idea of, that he wasn't necessarily referencing at the time, but that have just come to fruition in such grave ways that even someone like Moore, I don't know, could have predicted. So, I think this is a great book to start off our book club with. And what do you think of it?
Yeah, just to set the scene for everybody, I guess, if you're not familiar with the graphic novel or the film, it's essentially set in a post-Cold War England, where much of Europe and Africa, it's alluded to, has been hit with nuclear weapons. There's a couple of fragments where, Evie's like, I remember Dad telling me, like, oh, Africa's not there anymore, like, neither is Europe, like that kind of thing. Like, it's supposed to imply, like, the aftermath of a nuclear war at the end of the Cold War. And like England is just kind of surviving in this like uber fascist controlled state in its own island of the United Kingdom. I think it really is a reflection of its time. And I also, one of the things that I think is interesting to think about, when it was published in 1982, that was, the time between now and when this book was published is a similar timeline to between then and the Holocaust. And I think that that's really interesting, and it really informs the perspective that somebody like Alan Moore had. When you're talking about, like, you were a lot closer to this like extreme evil in history as something, this uber fascism. Also, you have the totalitarianism of the USSR, rising Thatcherism, Reagan economics, and cultural conservative ravaging the United States as a retaliation to all the progress that was made in the 60s and early 70s. I think that it's kind of like Terry Gilliam's Brazil, or in a way that it really is a reaction to that Thatcherism of the 1980s and a fear of what it could have become.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great point. And Brazil is a film we talked about a little bit earlier in this channel's history by Terry Gilliam, but it was born of the exact same circumstances. A reaction to Margaret Thatcher's kind of direction she was taking the country at the time. And I think similarly to this book, it kind of makes a very anti-government type statement. But again, I don't think it's necessarily a statement saying that, government, it's not just like a uniformly like libertarian message or whatever. It's just saying that this direction of government, this authoritarian path, leads to nothing good, and ultimately, does basically require a demolition to kind of start things back from step one. Right? I think he's kind of identifying the problems he sees in the government of his time and expounding on them, and saying, like, warning basically, if the public becomes complacent, if the public more of society's direction is up to the people's control, I think, as Alan Moore sees it, than a lot of people would. A lot of people, in their estimation, the government calls the shots, and the public is totally at the whim of the leaders. Alan Moore, actually, interestingly, he kind of places the blame a little bit for the authoritarianism in the populace, I think, in V for Vendetta. I think part of the point of this book is that he's warning people that fascism is a direct product of complacency, it's enabled by the public complacency and lack of pushback, lack of resistance.
Yeah, 100%. And just to echo that, I think that's evidence really clearly in some of the great quotes from this work. Famously, people shouldn't be afraid of their government, and government should be afraid of their people. That's one of the really big famous quotes from this novel. But one of the ones that I think is another takeaway, where he's putting a little bit of the blame on the people, where he says, we've had a string of embezzlers, frauds, liars, and lunatics making a string of catastrophic decisions. But who elected them? So I think that this breeds, and just to kind of take this as an opportunity to kind of open up this as a conversation starter, to what degree do you find the culpability of the electorate in situations like this, especially in a totalitarian, authoritarian surveillance state like the one that's envisioned and imagined and portrayed in V for Vendetta?
That's an interesting question, and I don't think I'm quite as down on the people as maybe Alan Moore is. I think I'm a little bit more sympathetic, especially in societies where we see a population that's very overworked, a population that's very exploited. People don't necessarily have the time, energy, or even education necessary to kind of resist against these kind of states. They just end up happening. So I'm not necessarily, willing to place the blame at the public quite maybe as much as Alan Moore does in this novel. But I think that this was probably born of a sentiment he was feeling at the time, where, under a Margaret Thatcher-like character, people probably weren't really resisting to it. Similarly to here in America, where, Reaganism was actually massively embraced. Reagan won his re-election in a sweeping landslide. People were not, resisting at all this direction of
it's morning in America.
Yeah, exactly. So I think that it's kind of born from a frustration, more seeing his fellow citizens just kind of give in to this style of government, to this very, kind of cruel governing style, and refusing to criticize it or push back in a meaningful way. And of course, I think my favorite thing about V for Vendetta, the graphic novel, which I can't, and I love the film too. We've talked about the film, but I think what separates the graphic novel from the film as a piece of art is that it refuses to really make a clear moral declaration. Alan Moore is an anarchist, and he talked about, when he wrote V for Vendetta, he said, I didn't just want to make it a black and white story. I didn't just want to make it the anarchists are the good guys and the fascists are the bad guys. He wants it to be a little bit more nuanced, some more gray in the middle there. And I think that's an expert decision that's really manifested in the fact that V himself, who's kind of the personification of anarchy, is not necessarily a totally moral or stable person. There's multiple points in this novel where Alan Moore really casts into question the morality of V. Said, is this a correct thing to do? Is this justified? And I think that's kind of what separates the book from the film, is that it is willing to engage in a little bit more of that interesting moral question of what's justified, what's not. V doesn't just in the movie, the villains, the government officials, they're almost cartoonish to an extent. They don't really have much depth to them. They're kind of just stereotypical power hungry villains. In the book, they have a little bit more humanity to them. You kind of understand their motivations a little bit more. And on the flip side, V's not necessarily just a superhero. He's not just like this badass
Matrix styles.
Yeah. It's implied that he has schizophrenia. It's implied a lot of things, and there are multiple points in the book that you can downright say that he's not necessarily making a moral decision. And I think that's what makes it an interesting read. And I think that's what makes it endure. The fact that it's not just a super.
And I think that's what makes it honest and uncontrived.
Yeah, exactly. It's not like V is Captain England. He just coming in to save the day and kick the ass of the totalitarian fascists. No, this is a very complex book about what is right, what is wrong, and how not just individually but how societally we should react to authoritarianism, to fascism, to these kind of concepts which seem to happen a little bit and then all at once.
100%. One of the other things that I think that the graphic novel really pays attention to in a way that the movie only has in the background is the media and the role that media plays in shaping a totalitarian culture, and the role of the fate, and just kind of really getting into the nitty gritty of like what's going on in the background when nobody's talking to the people, and why they're afraid, and why they're why they need to reassure the people, and why they need to have like messaging for the people. I don't know. Do you extrapolate anything on that, and do you see any ways that that kind of like party line messaging and the consistency of messaging is kind of like indicative in both of our major news broadcasting networks right now? Except right now, instead of getting one consistent messaging, it's like if you live on this block, you hear this thing, and if you live on this block, you hear like a different thing. And I'm wondering what the result of that is.
Yeah, I think that's definitely an apt observation, and something that I think is interesting too is that in the novel, this kind of the voice of London who speaks to people and is like the main authoritative voice that everyone's kind of supposed to just abide by or whatever. In the film, actually, they make the voice of England a TV show. It's more of like a Fox News type commentator, right? So I think the film kind of takes inspiration from the American politics of the time, especially under George Bush, and it was kind of applying a lot of those things. That's actually one instance where I do actually prefer the film version, because I think it is a very good commentary on the way that things like cable news and news entertainment have kind of been co-opted by the state to manufacture consent for their whatever they want to do. So I think that in that sense maybe the film's a little bit more less of its time than the book, where the book is a little bit more rooted in the technology of the time. What do you think?
Yeah, I think that it's one of those things. This was written in 1982, right? So the radio still played a lot larger of a role in people's lives. There is the scene, obviously, where he's presented on screen in the television booth right before, because he's threatening to like blow up before they broadcast. And so I think that there's an understanding that that's the direction that it's going. But I think that in a totalitarian state, he's drawing back a lot more to a more like Hitlerian type of totalitarian culture, where the radio was critical, and the messaging that you were spending to people orally over a radio was extremely important, right? For anybody who doesn't know, one of the first mandates of Hitler was getting a radio in every home in Germany. And that was because he wanted to spew his propaganda to everybody, but it also made them feel like they were being uplifted, right? So it was like a double whammy. And I think that he might be commenting on that a little bit. I think that Alan Moore's definitely read his history books. I think it's evidenced in this. He's throughout all the quotations. You mentioned when you were speaking that obviously that V is a complicated moral character, and that an honest reading of this does not lead you to side with V on 100% of his issues. And one of the issues that I diverged from V on, and I wanted to get your input on, was his idea and his really avowed belief that he kind of asserts throughout the novel, is that he really views violence and destruction as a form of purification. Right before he dies, he has the quote, the country is not saved, but all its old beliefs have come to rubble, and from rubble we may rebuild. And I sort of reject this concept that I think is adopted by many people, both on the left and the right, that violence can become this solution and form of purification. And my belief on that was really hardened after I read the Chris Hedges' work, War is a Force That Gives Us Meaning, where he kind of lays out the kind of experiences that he had as his 20 years as a war correspondent. And he talks about how the thing about violence is that while it's at times even necessity to gain power, what it immediately becomes is like a narcotic, and it becomes something that you chase, and there's an addictive quality to it, and it also a desensitization to it. And also it just it'll fundamentally like kind of change you the more that you participate in it, the more that you're exposed to it. The like humans undergo changes. So even if you're, altruistic and virtuistic in the way that you initially attempt, and I think a lot of revolutions and people in the past have been, I mean, we have a long history, right? But not just as a country, I meant as a world of humans. But I do think that one of the things where it's lost is the credibility and the morality that comes with the position is often lost through violence, which is why I think that it is tough to rebuild, and violence almost begets more violence in a different form, right? And that's why every violent revolution has just, kind of returned itself to its form. Even look at the French Revolution, which is heralded as like, one of the more successful like uprisings of the proletariat. I mean, look at France now, obviously they have healthcare and shit that we don't have, but it's not egalitarian, especially if you're a fucking Muslim.
Yeah. Yeah. I think there's definitely a lot of legitimacy to that. And I would agree for the most part that, I mean, I don't necessarily agree that, violence is a purifying force. And obviously a lot of times, it does lead to a lot of other consequences. Oftentimes when violence is committed in the name of a grand, movement or ideal, it kind of reduces that ideal or that movement down to just, an act of senseless violence that gets associated from then on out. But I do think this also leads to an interesting question, and this is something we talked about a little bit when we were talking about the film V for Vendetta, which is it kind of challenges the state monopoly on violence, and that is something that I think is expressed pretty well in this Alan Moore quote, actually, where he says, "I believe that all other political states are in fact variations or outgrowths of a basic state of anarchy. After all, when you mention the idea of anarchy to most people, they will tell you what a bad idea it is because the biggest gang would just take over, which is pretty much how I see contemporary society. We live in a badly developed anarchist situation in which the biggest gang has taken over and have declared that it is not an anarchist situation, that it is a capitalist or a communist situation. But I tend to think that anarchy is the most natural form of politics for a human being to actually practice." So I think in Alan Moore's view, the violence is already being committed. It's just by the state, by thugs, by this gang, which has taken over. And that, a V-like character is kind of challenging that monopoly. And again, in the very hyperbolized world of V for Vendetta, this is literal fascism. So I think that, in a situation as, laid out here where there are, concentration camps, I think that's a different question. V is clearly molded by an extreme experience of abuse and all of these state-sponsored acts of horror and terror against him. So I think that in that sense, it is a little bit more understandable. And again, V for Vendetta, it's about revenge.
Oh, 100%. Yeah, I'm not here to be like, oh my God, like shame on Alan Moore for that. But I just think that it raises this a complicated idea because in the I don't. Whenever taking power comes, there's going to be a violent reaction by the state, and I think it's really critical that we as a left understand how we are going to resist their violence and defend ourselves and the people around us and our communities from that violence, without becoming the same purveyors of violence and becoming consumed like the United States has become with expansive military powers, and like all empires are. So it's one of those things where it's like, how do you grow? And use violence as a means of protection and not as a means of moving the expansion, I guess. And just to kind of follow up on that quote of anarchy, there's also the quote from the book. Evie asks like, "Oh, is this what anarchy looks like?" And she's talking about the chaos that's erupted over the streets, and he says, "No, this is only the land of take what you want. Anarchy means without leaders, not without order. With anarchy comes an age or Ordnung, a true order, which is to say a voluntary order. This age of Ordnung will begin when the mad and incoherent cycle of Verwirrung that these bulletins reveal has run its course. This is not anarchy, Eve. This is chaos." And I think that is kind of really indicative of Alan Moore's personal political outlook and the way that he kind of rejects the idea that chaos is anarchism, and he's like, no, we have plenty of chaos without anarchism. Yes, there can be chaos under anarchism, but at its core, it's without leaders. And even a world without leaders can still have order is essentially the translation of what he's saying, because he uses a bunch of like German words to make the like poetic kind of like rhythmic thing work.
Yeah. I also wanted to play this quote or this little video where Alan Moore discusses anarchism a little bit, because I do think it's a good window into this text and into his thinking.
Anarchy is, and always has been, a romance. It is clearly the best way and the only morally sensible way to run the world. That everybody should be the master of their own destiny. Everybody should be their own leader. This is something that I still believe. I think that even a cursory look around the world at the moment, particularly at the moment, would reveal that it is about 0.00001% of the world's population that causes 99.99999% of the world's problems. And that tiny percentage, it's not the Jewish banking conspiracy. It's not the asylum seekers. It's not the secret homosexual conspiracy running Hollywood. It's not even the Scientologists. It is leaders. But what we need is an administration at most. We don't need people to boss us about.
Yeah, that's just a little bit of a window into, Moore's thought. And I'd recommend listening to more of him speak on the subject and read more of his thoughts, because he really is a great thinker on the issue. And again, I think ultimately, V for Vendetta, it succeeds because it is kind of, it's not about anarchism as a moral, this great moral alternative. It's about how anarchism is what is almost necessary in the wake of an authoritarian takeover, right?
Almost like reactionary anarchism.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's a big part of the reason why he makes the conscious effort for V to not be, a superhero who's just this totally moral character. And again, I think that's one of the flaws of the film, is that it does lean into that a little bit. There's a part in the book and in the movie where, spoiler alert, but the V's kind of sidekick, or whatever you want to call her, Evie, is literally tortured and imprisoned by V. Literally tortured. And in the movie, they kind of just gloss over it, and it's quickly all like, oh, it's all good. She was to teach her a lesson. I think in the book, it kind of dives a little bit deeper and gives you a little bit more of a
dehumanization process, that he was like, you have to go through this if you're ever going to look at the world with like untainted eyes. Essentially, what he's doing is he is putting her through the process of stripping her of her ideology, almost in the sense that the same way that putting on the glasses and They Live allowed him to allowed the character to view the world without the influence of ideology. V is asserting that by stripping yourself of happiness, you're freeing yourself from the cage of happiness or whatever, and also freeing yourself of being willing to die. Essentially, fear of nothing is the only way to look at the world without that lens of ideology, is essentially what he was arguing.
Yeah. And again, I just think I think it works, because everything that Moore is saying here, it's not like he's saying it as just a moral statement, right? He's presenting differing theories and differing reactions to authoritarianism, and letting the viewer kind of decide what's valid, or what they can take as positive versus negative. And that's why I think this, as I've said, this book endures as more than just kind of a black and white fascism versus anarchism. It's more than that, and it's a very fascinating read for that reason. There's also a lot more in the book that's just a little bit edgier than in the movie. Like Evie is a 16-year-old prostitute in the book versus a 20-something news anchor in the film. So it gets into some more kind of controversial and stuff like that. And also the big problem with the film, and this is something that Alan Moore, and again, I defend the film, I like it, but Alan
Moore doesn't.
And to be fair, V for Vendetta is without a doubt, a novel about anarchism. And in the film, they never even use the word anarchism once. And I think
Alan, big budget financing.
Exactly. And I'm a little bit conflicted, because again, the film definitely tries to it takes the inspiration of V for Vendetta, and it uses it to kind of tell a story that's more about kind of like George Bush era United States problems with the Patriot Act and with all this stuff. And that was what Alan Moore's problem with it was. He was like, you made my story about anarchism into this story, which is essentially a reaction to like George Bush neoconservatism, but you don't even prescribe anarchy as the solution, which was my point in the first place. So it's kind of like they take the
he feels undermined.
Yeah, and he kind of feels like they took the real point of the whole story out of it, which was kind of this proposition of anarchism as the solution to these overly totalitarian states. So I definitely agree that when it comes to a more serious engagement with the tenets and theory of anarchism, that the book definitely gets you a lot further. It's more intellectual. It gives you a little bit more to think about. But again, I don't dislike the film, and I think as far as big budget movies, it's about as politically radical as you can get.
Yeah, although I will say that to get on the spirit of anarchism and from the graphic novel perspective, I think you could a real like spiritual cousin of V for Vendetta is almost the Joker film that recently came out in the series. That it was a lot more fearless and a lot less a lot more direct, and obviously it got relentlessly smeared by like all kinds of factions on Twitter for reasons that I don't understand. Again, I don't have a Twitter account. I'm not up to date on what's acceptable to believe on the platform. But yeah, so either way, I thought, and I had my own problems with the film. I thought it hung a little bit too close to the taxi driver narrative. But as far as just like the politics of it and the fact that he like shoots the fucker at the end of the movie and doesn't give a shit, and it's like anarchy, that kind of uprising. I think is a lot more true to the like anarchist spirit that that vein that is so obvious, and not even a vein, like that through line of V for Vendetta. But
yeah, totally. And also just to add in, similar after V for Vendetta came out, the Guy Fawkes mask was kind of adopted universally around the world as a symbol of, I mean, in addition to the kind of more neckbeardy symbolism or whatever, but like in Egypt during the revolutionary moment in Egypt, a lot of
in the Arab Spring,
a lot of protesters wore the Guy Fawkes mask. Same with at Occupy Wall Street. And a similar thing with the Joker film, like you mentioned with Joaquin Phoenix.
Anonymous, when they shut down PlayStation Network, they also put on a Guy Fawkes mask.
Yeah, I mean, Anonymous adopted the Guy Fawkes mask as their entire symbol. So, but yeah, similarly with the Joker film, we've recently seen protests in countries around the world, like places like Chile and stuff, and you see people donning the Joker makeup. It's the same thing. Like people take that inspiration and the symbolism from the pop culture and actually directly incorporate it into their kind of revolutionary activism. We saw V masks at the George Floyd protests here in Kansas City. So I do think it's important. You can debate the merits or whatever, but I do think that kind of having these statements and our media and bold political statement is a good thing. That there's a reason why you can't watch V for Vendetta the film in China. It's banned by their authoritarian government. So I think it's overall a force for good. And again, I just appreciate that it does challenge the state monopoly on violence, the state monopoly on these kind of things, and it's an interesting piece of fiction.
100%, yeah. And I think it's a great Kickstarter for anybody who wants to follow along as we keep doing these weekly book readings. V for Vendetta is a quick read. I just sat down and read it on Friday night. And it's a great, entertaining, gripping graphic novel. It was something I hadn't read since I was probably 14 or 15, and I bought it for the first time. Just a really great, little fun read that also has a lot of political undertones. Next week, I think we're getting a little bit more serious with our episode, and we're going to do Homage to Catalonia, the Orwell classic. So be sure to tune in and get excited for that. Most of the time, I'm not sure if we'll be doing the book readings live. I imagine we will. But yeah, just here or there or whatever comes, we'll work it out. If people want to join in and join the discussion, we definitely can. Obviously, it's a little early right now, so we may do the book sessions at a little bit of a different time. But yeah.